Madam Speaker, this amendment simply authorizes the voluntary, and I stress voluntary, vegetation management within 150 feet of the exterior boundary of the right-of-way near structures on U.S. Forest Service land. You know, as a former energy regulator and a utility commissioner, I know there are many threats to power lines running across this country. And most of the time, this comes down to vegetation, as odd as it might seem, but especially in areas where there are a lot of trees and that are remote areas hard to get to. Off right-of-way vegetation management on these lands are the responsibility of the United States Forest Service. But for any number of reasons, they aren't conducting this critical work to ensure the reliability of our electricity. Utility companies don't want to do the work off their right-of-way due to the lack of clarity in their legal liability or a strict liability standard. This amendment provides that legal certainty and holds the utilities accountable for gross negligence or criminal misconduct. But lastly, it's important to note that this amendment demonstrates that this is not, and I stress, is not a backdoor to logging and prevents the sale of the vegetation by the utility and clarifies it shall be the property of the United States. Madam Speaker, I would also emphasize that the Edison Electric Institute and the American Public Power Association support this amendment, and I would reserve the balance of my time. Should anyone? I would yield to the chairman.
Madam Chair, I want to stress that this authorizes voluntary vegetation management within 150 feet of the exterior boundary of the right-of-way, prevents the sale of vegetation, and limits legal liability. I think it's a good amendment. Urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back to the gentleman from North Dakota.
And I reserve.
The gentleman from North Dakota reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Rise in opposition to the amendment. Claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. The manager's amendment to H.R. 8 already includes a provision which would hand over management of vast swaths of U.S. public lands to private corporations and other utility providers under the guise of preventing forest fires. This provision was inserted in the dead of night, and the full House won't get to vote on it, and this is a terrible way to treat our public lands. As if this weren't enough, this amendment will go even farther, allowing electric utilities to clear-cut a football field-length swath of national forests adjacent to transmission right-of-ways. It would also shift liability for fire damage caused by transmission infrastructure from the utilities to the American taxpayers, and that's just not right. The Forest Service and the BLM are already working with utilities to improve right-of-way maintenance, and both agencies testified before the Natural Resources Committee that prior agency approval is not necessary for emergency vegetation maintenance work. Mr. Huffman offered a common-sense amendment at markup which would have required proactive planning by utilities in coordination with land managers to identify and address potential fire threats. But every Republican voted against it. Instead, they're supporting legislation which would lead to less responsible stewardship of America's forest. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, power lines were responsible for causing only 0.03% of forest fires in the past 5 years. If Republicans were serious about preventing and fighting forest fires, they would work with us to adequately fund the Forest Service and fix the problem of fire borrowing, which last year burned up 52% of the agency's budget. But this isn't about solving a problem. This is about control. It's regrettable that House Republicans seek to give away the people's land to private interests, and let's just not. It's outrageous that this would happen. And Madam Speaker, I urge a no vote on the amendment, and I yield back I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Madam Chair, I just want to correct a couple of the statements made sincerely by the opposition to this. I want to be clear that the cost of this is borne not by the taxpayers, but by the utility themselves. And the reason that they're not able to do it now, of course, is because of liability, lack of clarity in the liability. So this simply clears that part of it up. And again, I want to get back to, I was a regulator for nearly 10 years. And some people may remember, not so many years ago, a major rolling brownout that led to blackouts in the northeastern part of this country. All of that was caused by trees growing into transmission lines. It has a cascading effect. And yes, when those trees, if it's a large forest, those trees growing into transmission lines can also create forest fires. This is a very basic approach. Most of the arguments that the gentleman raised are to the underlying bill, not to this amendment. This amendment is very straightforward, and with that, I would urge a yes vote in reserve.
The gentleman from North Dakota reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I will yield back, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back. The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Again, I urge a yes and yield back.